Hey everybody, there's a special feature here for you. I'm going to talk about the N64 Anthology that has arrived at long last. I first heard about the Kickstarter project for this to get published in English. This company called Geeks Line from France. They publish all these console retrospectives, but Glenn Plant, I think, was the first person I heard about from on the Kickstarter for an English printing of the Nintendo 64 one. Not surprisingly, Glenn Plant. And that was back in May or June, and I was so excited about it. My girlfriend is actually the fantastic person who fronted the money for it, because I had to have the nicest possible one. So what I have here is actually the box art collection pack. So to start out with, this is almost everything that came with it. There was also a special lithograph that came as a stretch goal as well. This was the first stretch goal just when the book got funded for the printing itself. There was a special bookmark when it reached this 50,000 mark. This was tied in the little fabric bookmark that was in here originally, but it came off of it. It was just tied to it, and I'm okay with that. It had to happen eventually. And then this is the box art collection and the slipcover that the two come in. So first, obviously, we'll look at the main book. This is the collector's edition of the book, and the reason I want people to be able to see this kind of exploration of the book itself is because it's actually going to be available in English on Amazon in a couple months in like January. And so I really want people to be able to see what they're going to get with the book itself, because spoilers, it is a phenomenal book and I'm so happy with it. So sort of section by section, first of all, this is with the box art collection. This is the collector's edition book. And this particular one was printed in 550 copies. It was said 500, but there was 50 additional printed ones in case of damages or shipping problems or anything. And I have 517 for mine. And it was written by Math Manette, who did a great job. I hope I'm saying his last name right. Math Manette or Math Manette, whatever. As a French person, I probably said that name wrong. Unlike if you've seen the Playing with Power book, which I bought last week, the paper is a really, really high quality. It's like, glossy picture paper as opposed to sort of like a newsprint feeling sort of thing. So the foreword for the English print was done by Glenn Plant. Does a really good job, and someone who's really passionate about this. I'm glad that Glenn Plant was actually a huge part of making this book work. So great job. And there's the author's foreword. So the first 60-something pages of the book or so are basically a history. And the history starts with this section, really, really in-depth section of the origins of the console from when it was first conceived, continued to be announced, shown off, etc., etc., at trade shows and everything. And this was fantastic for me reading this part because I knew that the 64 had a rough launch. Don't get me wrong. I was fully aware of that, but I did not really understand the full catastrophe that kind of followed it for the first 2 or 3 years of its development before it came out in '96. I knew that the Ultra 64 had been delayed a lot and everything like that, but it had a tough time. I didn't even realize to the point that people from the press started thinking that Nintendo was bluffing about it. And so there's some really great stuff in there, a lot of technical stuff that was being shown off from time to time before the console was launched, but overall that's a great section. And then what could have been a little bit more in-depth, I think a lot of space was given to the origin section, and so it seems like the actual lifespan of the console seemed to be moved through a bit quickly in my opinion. But given that the console was already out itself, maybe the actual games from release to release maybe didn't carry as much of an anecdotal or as much of like a coherent history. So maybe that one was probably moved through a little bit more quickly than I would have liked, but still a really good like it gives you the ability to really follow the system as it was coming out and trying to compete with the Nintendo, and you get a good idea of, good points and high points and low points and everything, like sales figures and everything for the console itself. So it's still a really good section. I would have actually liked a little bit more of certain games and the impact that they had on the sales and everything, but still really good. And then this section was actually really fantastic, I thought. This is sort of after the GameCube had come out and after the 64 had been discontinued. And it let me get, first of all, a really, really good section on the IQ player, which was one thing that I had always wanted to know more about, but I couldn't really get a good grasp of what it was all about. So just the IQ player itself section was phenomenal. And then some other stuff about remakes and ports and how certain games had that sort of legacy that lived on even up to now with the 3D remakes that they do on the 3DS. And then two really good sections before we get to the bulk of the book, which is the games library. Interviews with, first, Martin Hollis, who was a big developer on GoldenEye, and this is a really good one. This was really interesting, especially I loved when the author asks about how Nintendo, the higher-ups from Nintendo, were not so much involved in GoldenEye, and asking if Miyamoto had any contact with them while they were making it. And there's a great thing that they just said, we didn't really know what he meant by what he said, so we just kind of ignored it, which is, to me, that's such a Miyamoto story for me. Just the way that he seems to do things and get his hands into different people's projects, that was like, I didn't know what he meant, so I just ignored it. That was great. And then next is an interview with Eric Kane from Titus. And so Titus kind of elicits a groan naturally from me, but I was actually really glad that we got to see Titus cast in more of a more beneficial light to them. But on the other hand, that sort of like positive light was a little bit overpowering, because as much as you want to hear them talk about Superman and the catastrophe that was for the system, not of ET proportions or anything like that, but it seems like the author, or whoever was conducting the interview, almost wanted to avoid the sour note of Superman. So I would have liked to hear more of what have you got to say for yourself then. Hey, you guys were really interesting, but it's still interesting to hear the Eric Kane from Titus talk about how they approach things. And then there's some more stuff from other developers at the time, and whether or not that they were supporting the 64. So it was interesting. It was only one page, or only, like, page and a half, but even so. Hardware was great. The hardware, I loved this page with all these pictures that were included of the various models of system, the Pikachu models and the Fantastic models, and the Daihawks Japanese baseball team model of 64. These are awesome. I love knowing that these exist. I love these packaging shots of the different bundles that came out for the system. And this is just a shot of the internal components of the system, which is surprisingly easy to understand for me, which I usually don't have any idea what any of the technical specs are talking about. But when I saw this, I actually realized why 64s never break, because that is a remarkably simple circuit board. Even I could see what the important parts are on that. So that was cool. All the controllers, same as the consoles, really, really good to see all the different iterations of it. And even the Hori mini pads. I still don't have a Hori mini pad, and I would really, really love just one Hori mini pad. and all it did was make me want it. And the Lognet controller over here, really cool. Just really awesome shots of different things, different stuff that you don't really think about as much as the games themselves, but when you have to think of the console as a whole, you start to think about literally every little tiny thing that goes into it. This is one of the times that you have to consider that the person who wrote this and made up this whole book was from Europe, because I was expecting a little bit more of this section, which was like third-party accessories, such as from Mad Catz, from people that made the shark pads and stuff. And I realized that that's such a ridiculously comprehensive section. If that were actually included, that would be a whole book in and of itself. So I would have liked to see a couple of things more explored with this, but it gets a pass because it probably would have been very different from what I would write if I had the ability to do that. And then, of course, this is the bulk of the book here. This is the full exploration of the games library. This is all 388 games that were released for the system in every region. They all get their own rundown. It was like a little bit mini review. All the important factoids, like alternate titles, publisher, developer, pack size, which is really interesting to me. Just so, like, when you see like the Resident Evil cartridge, Resident Evil 2 is a 64 megabyte cartridge, and that's always interesting. So, like, what cartridges, what games took different size cartridges is a weirdly interesting thing to me. The release dates is a very important thing to me as well, because I'm trying to do all this stuff in chronological order, and I want this fact-checking to be available to me when I go off the Wikipedia list, because I don't really buy it necessarily. And then there's one little gripe that I have with this on my personal level, because you can see he has sales figures here, rarity and rating. So rating is appropriately subjective based on the author, so I disagree with him a little bit on this, but rarity is a bit less subjective, a lot more objective, and I'm taking into account that this is written from a European author's perspective and someone who is based in the European markets and everything, but I disagree a lot with the rarity just based on my experience at the store and having had to collect my whole set of games. And having the sales figures right next to it is especially telling of how the rarity just doesn't seem to match up sometimes. I've had the conversation many times that Conker's Bad Fur Day is not a rare game. It's a sought-after game, and it's an expensive game. But it by no means deserves a 5-star rarity rating, because it's just not that hard to find. You can find it, and you'll pay a lot for it, but you won't have a hard time seeking one out. A game that I see 6-8 times a year at the store, that you can have 2 or 3 of in stock at any one time, is not that rare. Whereas, a lot of games in here should have 1-star ratings, even 2 or 3-star ratings. But if I go to Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask is given a 3-star rarity rating. And even Ocarina of Time, a game that sold 7.6 million copies worldwide, has a 2-star rarity rating, and that doesn't really make sense. It's sought after because people want to play it, but it's one of those things where rarity isn't the right word to describe that. That's a personal gripe for me. I feel like I've spent a little bit too long on it, but it's something that I always want to talk about when it comes to the rare games and the used games market, especially with my experience doing it as a job and as a collector as well. So this was my sort of stage to address that, because even someone who's writing a book like this doesn't seem to have the same understanding of it as someone that I guess I have a professional experience with it. Everything else about the games library thing is really fantastic, and that gripe that I have is really, really personal. And the game library is probably one of the by far the most entertaining aspects of this book, because you get to see so many different games that you would not have any idea exist otherwise. I knew some games that came out in Japan that we didn't get over here, but it's taken me really into the deep and exotic parts of the import scene, really, and I'm in a weird place of the book where I can't really find any, but I didn't even realize that Robopon had a game on the 64. That's how much I don't know about imports, but nevertheless, I mean, it's really, really entertaining, whether it's a game you know, a game you're familiar with but you haven't played, or a game that you don't know at all. Reading the summations, the anecdotes, and all the different little factoids about the games is really, really entertaining. So that's probably one of the best parts of the book. Immediately following the games library is the disk drive section, which was super helpful to me because the disk drive is something I've really had no idea of anything about, and it was actually really fascinating to read about the disk drive. It has the same thing as the games library and the hardware section in and of itself. It's basically, this was not included in the hardware section because it had its own section as a peripheral, and some really, really cool things. The F-Zero expansion kit sounds awesome, even if I don't like F-Zero that much. I still think that's awesome. Doshin the Giant actually seems really cool too. So it's one of those things that makes you upset, but not as upset as the canceled game section makes me, because reading basically any kind of information about a game that we were supposed to get and never did, it's just depressing. 40 Wings, I played that on the PS1. I'm not actually that upset about that, but Dinosaur Planet will always be my biggest disappointment with Nintendo and Shigeru Miyamoto. Other games like Dragon Sword, Eternal Darkness, which of course we got on the GameCube. I'm not that upset about Eternal Darkness. We got that game. And that's the story of a couple of these games. They either came out on the GameCube or they came out somewhere else, but I would have loved them on the 64. I would have loved anything that gave the N64 another strong game, and this is like 5 or 6 pages on in-depth looks at games that never came out. And then this whole list of games that I've seen like on Pack Watch and old Nintendo Powers and just heard rumors about, and it's just a whole list of games that just makes me so upset that we never got them. Finally, for the standard edition stuff, this is rare and collector's items, which is really cool. It is funny though to look at somebody who's from like Europe considering some rare and collector's items and look at the Donkey Kong pack, which makes its way into this section. I think that's funny because it's so common over here. It's just the way that it was sold to us, but for someone who's from France, it's actually considered like an oddity or something like that. It's different from the other side of the fence, basically. What other people have that you didn't get, which is also why the imports thing is so interesting. And then, of course, just I want everything in the section, the collector's item stuff. There's clocks and carrying bags and a Zelda archery kit and just all this stuff that Nintendo reps handed out or that were available Pogs from Taco Bell. And the Pogs from Taco Bell is actually a perfect example of the unofficial nature of this, because, you know, some of these pictures aren't the best quality, but, I mean, really bravo for the effort, for effort on them, because, you know, I feel like it must be impossible to find a good resolution picture of the Taco Bell Mario Pogs from the N64 era. So I have to point out that you should give a little bit of credit to a low-res picture, because they worked really hard to get that. And then another really fascinating section is, I just realized I said not last but not least. It's not the last but not least at all. Nintendo 64 around the world, much like the IQ player, which was a thing for China, this was also really interesting to see how Nintendo has to approach other markets, specifically for the N64, especially like Brazil or South Korea, who, like China, have really strict import laws on video games. This is little bit less interesting section for me, just because I won't ever use it. The Collector's Corner is like a big checklist, where they intend for you to check off like I would ever write in this book, ever. Especially considering that I already have the full set, so I don't really need to use this section, but it's cool that it's in there with the list like that, especially because the index, I feel, is a little bit off, because the index, instead of just having the games listed alphabetically, which is, I guess that's how they are in the games library, but it seems almost unnecessary to have them in the categorized nature like that. If they're already alphabetical, why did they have to be given a list of contents? My name's in here. This is the list of all the Kickstarter backers. My name is here. Derek McLeod right over here. And also, Matt Hickey from Core Gaming is right there. So, 2 of the 3 people that work at Core Gaming have their names in this book. Matt's mom got him in here, which is pretty awesome. I found that today. I didn't even know he was in here. Texted him and was like, "Did you donate to this?" And he was like, "No, that's weird." It was his mom. Unfortunately, this section is not going to be in the standard edition. This is for the collector's edition, so it won't be in the standard edition that's available on Amazon. But it is one of my favorite sections, and it's something that I actually wish was longer. And this is the last section of the book. But it's all advertising, which is half the reason that I read old Nintendo Powers and stuff, is to look at all these crazy ads. And these include ads from all regions. So this is like a French ad for Mario Golf. This is one for Superman, an English one. The Japanese ads, which are really fantastic, look a lot like the artwork in most cases for the Japanese games, which is really cool. And of course, I can't forget that I have to go get the box art collection and show everybody, even though that's real quick. This is just a really fascinating section. Ads from all over the world. You can see how America has just some pretty vulgar and brutal ads compared to some pretty straightforward ads that they have in Japan.